I always am greatly entertained at how many pastors invite me and talk about what a wonderful preacher I am and how great it is to hear me speak, and they've never heard me speak before. So let's see if he says the same thing next time. It is good to be back with you, and if I am doing this a whole lot, and if I'm doing that a whole lot, I apologize. I had the flu earlier this week, and I'm several days past contagious, but I haven't quite gotten the system back to normal. But the church is a place where we can not be normal, but we can be loved. Would you pray with me? Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. There are a number of interesting things about our gospel lesson this morning, which Pastor Kongse read, that would be fun to point out and discuss in a longer sermon. That's the good news, right? Longer, like this can be short. We could mention that Jesus' response to hearing about the murder of John the Baptizer was not to jump into a reaction, but was to first withdraw and grieve and process the terrible loss. We could mention that Jesus' response to seeing the crowds was to have compassion on them, to put aside his needs and go help them. We could mention that Jesus' response to the disciples telling Jesus to send away the hungry crowds was neither to give in and let them off the hook, nor to jump in and solve the problem for them, but to delegate it back to them, saying, "You give them something to eat." That pushback from Jesus would be a great topic and would make all of you uncomfortable, wouldn't it? After all, the disciples in the Bible are often a proxy for us. That is, as contemporary readers and listeners to the Word, when Jesus is telling the disciples something, we should understand that he may now be telling us that same thing and get the appropriate lesson from it. Let me come back to that. By the way, we could also mention that the cultural bias of the person reporting the events of that day, when he said there were 5,000 people. Oh, and yeah, women and children, but they don't really count. The editor of your edition of the Bible probably perpetuates that marginalization of women by making the heading for the section, "The Feeding of the 5,000." Imagine if the National Park Service did that when reporting the number of people attending the presidential inauguration. Different times. However, since this is a communion Sunday, what I'd like to briefly look at this morning is the meal itself, which, as many of us imagine it happening, feels an awful lot like the breaking and sharing of bread for communion. Too often we skip over the meal in the story because apparently miracle stories are controversial. Someone who sallies forth to preach on this usually winds up taking a hard line about it. It absolutely happened this way. And it was divine and supernatural, and every word is exactly true. Or, well, obviously it didn't really happen that way. So let's talk about Jesus' leadership and how he got them to stop selfishly holding back what they had, and they shared with everyone, and it all worked out. And isn't that just like pledging to the church? Well, there's an old rabbinical saying that anytime you're given two options, always pick the third. Or, as I might put it, you're missing the point. How so? Neil Gaiman is a well-known British fiction writer. He wrote, among other things, American Gods, which maybe some of you are watching on TV right now. And in a 2002 book, he paraphrased another great British writer and Christian theologian from a century before, G.K. Chesterton. He wrote, "Fairy tales are more than true, not because they tell us dragons exist, but because they tell us dragons can be beaten." Fairy tales are more than true, not because they tell us that dragons exist, but because they tell us that dragons can be beaten. That dragons can be slain, that things are less impossible than we tend to think is, I think, the real point of the story of the feeding. Arguing about which way it should be read or understood is to miss the point of the story. However it happened, what did happen is that when the disciples' backs were up against the wall, when there was a seemingly insurmountable obstacle in carrying out the audacious ministry task which Jesus had set before them, somehow enough resources were found, and the people who were in need were all served. That's what the disciples of Jesus learned that day. They simply did what they were told, which was a faithful response to Jesus, even if they had their doubts. And through the power of God, it worked out. So, remember earlier when we said that what Jesus was teaching the disciples then might be what Jesus is teaching the current disciples? What might Jesus want you to learn from the point of that story? Let me ask you this. Are you old or not in good health or poor or have some other obstacles in your life that make you think, oh, God can't be asking me to do anything because I really can't do much of anything? Is your church kind of old, not in good health, rather poor, maybe has some other obstacles? And so you think, oh, God can't really be asking us to do anything because we really can't do much of anything? How does that stack up against our gospel lesson for this morning? You may be afraid that you won't have enough of whatever it is that is needed. But what we should learn today is that together with God, you will have enough. My friends, God is calling you, individually and as a church, to do something for God's kingdom, for God's children. Now, I'm not a prophet. I don't profess to know what that is. But if you think you are here solely for your own benefit, I'm here to tell you this: you're confused. You are here. You are here to do something that makes a difference in the lives of someone else. The disciples then had their doubts and were reluctant to take that assignment, but they did. And as a result, something amazing happened. You need to take that assignment too, whatever that is. As you come forward for the communion meal this morning, reflect on how there was more than enough that day to feed the thousands. And just like we won't run out of bread to feed you here, you won't run out of what's needed to serve God. Don't let fear hold you back. On ancient maps where the unknown was scary and from which explorers had not returned back with scouting reports, map makers would write, "Here there be dragons," because they were afraid. But Jesus teaches us that dragons can be beaten. Where God provides the vision, God provides the provision. So come forward in faith, and then, even with your doubts, go out in faith and do something amazing. Amen.